He opened the door expecting wind and snow, but instead, he saw a baby bear collapsed on his porch, shivering and crying like a lost child. What happened next would haunt him forever. Welcome to Mr. Whisker's Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful, emotional stories that need to be told. Thank you, and let's get back to the story. The wind that night was sharp enough to slice through bone. It howled like a ghost across the frozen forest, rattling branches and whistling through the cracks of an old log cabin nestled deep in the Montana wilderness. The snow had been falling relentlessly since sundown, blanketing everything in a thick, glittering coat of silence. Inside the cabin, Daniel Foster stirred from a light sleep on his recliner, a half-read book sliding off his chest. At 63, Daniel was used to the solitude. After losing his wife to cancer and his son in a car accident years ago, he had retreated to this isolated cabin to avoid the weight of human interaction. Here, in the heart of the woods, grief felt less suffocating. But something was off tonight. A faint, repetitive sound had interrupted the stillness. At first, Daniel thought it was just the wind shifting the shutters or maybe a raccoon knocking something over. He closed his eyes again, pulling the thick quilt tighter around his shoulders. Then he heard it again, not a knock exactly, but a slow, dragging scrape, like claws against glass. He opened his eyes, heart suddenly alert. A chill went down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. He set the book down and turned toward the window nearest his reading chair. It was frosted over, the condensation thick from the warmth of the fire inside. As he walked closer, the sound grew louder. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It wasn't frantic. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something weak was trying to get in or get his attention. Wiping the fog from the window with the sleeve of his flannel shirt, Daniel peered out into the snowy night and froze. Just inches from the glass was a small bear cub, barely more than a few months old. Its paws were pressed against the pane, its head tilted, and its black eyes were wide with fear and confusion. Snow clung to its fur in heavy clumps, and its breathing was rapid, little white clouds puffing into the icy air. But what shook Daniel wasn't just the sight of the cub. It was the sound that followed. A cry. Not a growl. Not a roar. A heartbreaking, high-pitched wail, like a child sobbing in the dark. The cub slumped slightly, its strength clearly failing, and gave a weak scratch against the glass one more time. Then it curled up into a pitiful ball on the porch, its tiny form barely distinguishable from the snowdrifts. Daniel backed away from the window, his heart thudding hard in his chest. Every survival instinct told him to stay inside, to leave the wildlife to the wild. You don't just open your door to a bear, no matter how small or sad it looks. Especially not in the dead of winter. But something about the cub's desperation pierced through his walls he'd spent years building. He grabbed his flashlight and slowly unlatched the door, bracing himself against the cold. The wind slapped him immediately, and his breath caught in his throat. He stepped out onto the porch cautiously, eyes locked on the cub. The animal didn't move. It was still curled up, shaking violently, covered in snow and ice. Its eyes barely fluttered open when the door creaked. Daniel knelt down a few feet away, flashlight in one hand, the other cautiously extended. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Where's your mama?" The cub let out another small cry, weaker this time. It tried to stand but stumbled. Daniel's gut twisted. This wasn't normal. Cubs didn't approach humans unless they were starving or orphaned. But something about this cub's condition told him it wasn't just lost, it was seeking help. And then he saw it, blood on its hind leg, a gash that looked fresh but not fatal. It must have happened recently, maybe while crossing sharp ice or fleeing from danger. The cub's eyes flicked up to meet his, and in that instant, Daniel felt something inside him shift. It wasn't just pity. It was a painful recognition. That same hollow, haunted look he had seen in the mirror after his son died. Without fully thinking it through, he rose and walked back inside the cabin, leaving the door slightly ajar. He grabbed a thick towel and an old heating pad from a drawer. When he returned, the cub hadn't moved. It was too exhausted. Slowly, carefully, he approached and wrapped the towel around it. The cub flinched but didn't fight. Its tiny body was ice cold. "This is crazy," Daniel muttered to himself. Absolutely insane. And yet, he scooped the cub into his arms, cradling it as if it were a wounded puppy, and carried it inside. The warmth of the fire hit the cub immediately, and its eyes blinked slowly as if trying to understand what was happening. Daniel laid it gently by the hearth, wrapped in the towel, and placed the heating pad beneath it on low. He sat nearby, watching closely, still half expecting it to bolt or lash out. But the cub just lay there, too tired to move, but visibly breathing easier. Daniel had never in his life done anything like this. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't a rescuer. He was a retired carpenter who'd spent the last few years hiding from the world. But now, in his cabin, lay a helpless creature that had cried at his window like it knew, somehow, that he was its only chance. He stayed up all night, feeding the fire, checking the cub's breathing, cleaning the wound with warm water and a cotton cloth. At one point, he tried offering it a bit of water with honey, the only sweet thing he had left, and to his amazement, the cub drank, slowly licking from the spoon. As the hours passed, Daniel found himself whispering to the cub, telling it about his wife, about his son, about the pain he'd buried so deeply. The cub, of course, didn't understand the words, but it listened. Its ears flicked, its tiny eyes stayed on him. And when the wind howled again, it inched closer to the fire and to Daniel. Just before dawn, as the sky turned from black to a dim steel gray, Daniel noticed the cub's breathing had slowed. Not in a bad way, in a peaceful, sleeping way. It was resting. Safe, for the first time in who knew how long. Daniel leaned back against the recliner, exhausted but strangely at peace himself. He hadn't spoken that much in years. And just as he started to drift off, a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. If this cub was here alone, hurt, starving, and willing to brave a human cabin for help, where was the mother? And was she still out there? The cabin was silent again, but it was no longer the hollow kind of silence that Daniel had grown so used to. This time, it was filled with something else, something alive, vulnerable, and deeply unsettling. The cub slept peacefully by the fireplace, its small body rising and falling with steady, shallow breaths, a tiny patch of snow-melted fur reflecting the golden light of the flames. Daniel, meanwhile, sat in the wooden chair by the window, his face lined with concern and uncertainty. He couldn't stop thinking about the mother. Bears, even grizzlies, don't simply abandon their young unless something is very, very wrong. For a cub to seek out human shelter, that defied all instinct, both the animals and Daniel's. He leaned forward, squinting out into the gray-blue haze of the morning. The storm had softened, leaving behind a surreal winter landscape. Snow piled on every surface, the trees drooping under its weight, the wind reduced to occasional sighs through the evergreens. He couldn't ignore it anymore. If the mother was out there, wounded, dead, or worse, it was only right to find her. Not just for closure, but because the cub might not survive without answers. Daniel threw on his coat, layered a scarf around his neck, and slid his old hunting boots over thick socks. He grabbed the walking stick he'd fashioned years ago, sturdy, worn smooth from time, and stepped out onto the porch, gently closing the door behind him so the warmth wouldn't escape. The snow crunched beneath his weight as he moved cautiously toward the edge of the tree lane. The forest had a different energy today. The storm had scrubbed the world clean, but it had also left clues in its wake. Every paw print, every bent branch, every trail disturbed in the otherwise untouched snow could tell a story, if you knew how to read it. And Daniel, despite his years of solitude, had once been an expert tracker. It didn't take long to find the cub's trail. Small, erratic prints led from the dense woods straight to the porch, staggered and unsteady. Beside them, barely visible in some places, were much larger tracks of bear's tracks, but they stopped abruptly halfway through the clearing. Daniel crouched, running a gloved hand over the snow. There were signs of struggle here, churned snow, a streak of blood frozen into a pale red ribbon, and claw marks trailing off in an awkward arc. She had been here, and she had been in trouble. His breath caught in his throat as he followed the blood trail further into the forest, careful not to disturb the tracks too much. The trees thickened quickly, swallowing him in shadow and muffling the sounds of the world. His boots sank deeper as he walked, and he could feel the cold creeping up his legs, but he pressed on, heart pounding harder with each step. After nearly an hour of trekking, the trail grew fainter. The blood had dried, leaving only occasional smudges against rocks or bark. The ground dipped slightly, leading to a frozen creek surrounded by a circle of tall pines. And then, he saw her. She was lying just beyond the edge of the creek, her enormous form partially buried in snow. At first, he thought she was dead, her body so still, her fur stiff with frost. But then, her chest rose slightly. Barely. She was alive, but only just. Daniel approached slowly, keeping his voice low. "Hey, it's okay, girl. I'm not here to hurt you." The mother bear shifted her head an inch, her eye catching his movement. There was no aggression in her gaze, only exhaustion. Her left side was soaked in blood, and one of her front paws was twisted unnaturally beneath her. She'd been injured, severely. Maybe by a poacher. Maybe by another predator. Whatever the case, she had used the last of her strength to bring her cub to safety, and then collapsed. Daniel stood there for a moment, torn. He had no idea how to help an animal this size. Even if he had a truck, which he didn't, she was too big to move. And even if he called wildlife services, which might take hours to reach them, she might not last that long. The rules of the wild were clear. Animals lived, fought, and died on their own terms. But Daniel had already broken the rules once. He had let the cub in. And now, he couldn't just walk away. He took off his coat and folded it into a makeshift pillow, sliding it gently beneath her massive head. She didn't resist. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. Her breathing slowed slightly, and her eyes closed, if only for a moment. Daniel sat beside her in the snow, pressing his hand lightly against her fur, feeling the slow, fading rhythm of her heartbeat. "You did good," he whispered. "You got her to safety. She's warm now. She's safe." The bear made a low, guttural sound, not a growl, but something like a sigh. A release. Daniel felt tears well in his eyes, catching him off guard. He hadn't cried in years, not since the funeral. But here, in the cold, beside this dying creature, the grief and empathy mingled and overflowed. He stayed with her for as long as he could, until the cold began to gnaw at his joints and his fingers went numb. Before he left, he took a piece of charcoal from his pocket, something he always carried for marking trees, and drew a symbol on the bark beside her. A circle with a line through it. The sign his late son used to draw when he was a child, symbolizing safe place. It wasn't much, but it felt right. When he returned to the cabin, the cub was awake, barely, its nose twitching at the smell of Daniel's clothes. It seemed to sense what he had done. It didn't cry again. Instead, it simply crawled closer to the fireplace, curling into the towel Daniel had left behind. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat in the rocking chair by the fire, a heavy stillness pressing against his ribs. Outside, the wind picked up again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something had passed, a weight, a life, a final act of love. And inside, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt less alone. The following morning, Daniel awoke in the chair, stiff and sore, with the soft creak of wood settling in the warmth and the low crackle of the fire the only sounds breaking the stillness. His back ached, his neck popped when he turned it, and yet none of that mattered. His eyes immediately went to the cub, still curled in the same spot by the hearth, its tiny chest rising and falling beneath the blanket Daniel had gently draped over it in the early hours before sleep finally claimed him. He stood slowly, every joint complaining as he shuffled into the kitchen. He boiled water on the stovetop and brewed a fresh pot of strong black tea, the scent of which drifted across the cabin like a lifeline. He wasn't used to this kind of stillness anymore, not the quiet kind, but the kind that meant he wasn't alone. The cub stirred, lifting its head groggily and letting out a soft, hoarse cry. Daniel turned, kneeling slowly beside the animal with a small bowl of lukewarm water and a mixture of soft oatmeal, mashed banana, and powdered goat's milk, an old hunting camp trick for rescuing injured wildlife. The cub didn't hesitate this time. It drank the water greedily, then sniffed at the warm food before eating with small, cautious bites. Every movement it made was a confirmation. It was still alive, still fighting, and it was beginning to trust him. Daniel's hands trembled as he cleaned a bit of mush off the cub's chin. The sight took him back in time, back to when his own son was small, barely able to sit upright in a high chair without tilting over. He remembered feeding him mashed fruit the same way, watching him try to smile with a mouthful of food. A strange ache bloomed in Daniel's chest, one that hadn't surfaced in years, one he'd buried deep under layers of routine and silence. But the cub didn't give him time to wallow. After eating, it stood shakily and began exploring the cabin. It sniffed the walls, rubbed its nose along the baseboards, and even pawed gently at the woven rug by the front door. When it reached the window where it had first appeared, it sat back on its haunches and looked out into the snow. Daniel followed its gaze. He didn't say anything, but he knew what it was looking for. The mother. And she wasn't coming back. He stepped outside into the blinding white, shielding his eyes from the morning glare. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but he didn't care. He walked through the same trail he'd made the day before, back to the frozen creek where he'd left the mother bear beneath his coat. But when he reached the spot, the clearing shaded by tall pine trees, he froze. She was gone. Her massive form no longer lay by the creek bed. All that remained were faint impressions in the snow and the coat, still balled up, slightly frozen, resting untouched beside a large patch of disturbed earth and scattered pine needles. No drag marks, no new blood. Just nothing. Daniel's pulse quickened. He scanned the trees, the hillsides, the shadows between trunks. No birds called. No branches cracked. The forest held its breath. And then, something moved. From deeper within the woods, a shadow stepped forward, limping, slow, but unmistakably real. It was her, the mother bear. She had survived the night. Her gait was still strained, one paw dragging behind her, but she moved with intention now, her eyes clear. When she saw Daniel, she stopped. The two of them stared at one another for what felt like minutes. She didn't snarl, didn't charge. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly and sniffed the air, as if recognizing him not as threat, but as witness. He took a slow step backward, not wanting to interfere. The mother bear moved past him, retracing the path back toward the cabin. He followed at a distance, heart racing. By the time they reached the cabin, the cub was waiting by the window, paws pressed against the pane. The moment the mother appeared, the cub let out a sharp cry, high-pitched and urgent, and the mother responded with a low, guttural chuff. Daniel quickly opened the door and stepped aside. The mother didn't enter this time. Instead, she sat down just beyond the porch, breathing heavily. The cub scampered outside, hesitant at first, then faster and pressed against her side. Daniel watched, a lump rising in his throat. It was a reunion. Quiet, desperate, and miraculous. The mother nuzzled the cub, licking the snow off its fur, inspecting it for injuries with slow, deliberate movements. She let out another sound, deeper this time, and the cub settled down beside her. Daniel stood in the doorway, unsure what to do. But then, the mother lifted her gaze to him again. And for a brief, impossible moment, she nodded. He swore she did. Then she turned and began to walk away, cub in tow. Limping, tired, but determined. She didn't look back. Daniel stood there long after they disappeared into the trees. That night, back inside the cabin, the silence returned, but it wasn't lonely. It was full of meaning, memory, and peace. Daniel sat down by the fire, picked up the old photo of his son from the mantel, and whispered, "We helped today, buddy. We really did." And for the first time in years, he smiled. The next morning dawned in an eerie hush, the kind of stillness that blanketed the landscape after a heavy snowfall. No wind whispered through the trees. No birds called from the branches. The white forest surrounding the cabin looked like a painting frozen in time. Daniel awoke in his bed for the first time in days, wrapped tightly in wool blankets, the scent of pine smoke clinging to the air. He had slept, truly slept, not the restless kind that visited him in short, fractured stretches over the years. But now something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake, the kind that settled in your bones before your brain could make sense of it. He rose, moved to the kitchen, and poured himself a cup of black coffee. As he sipped, he glanced toward the front window instinctively, and his heart stilled. There, at the exact same spot as before, sat the cub. Alone. It was pressed against the window pane again, tiny claws gripping the wooden sill, its nose flattened against the frosted glass. Its eyes looked duller than before, as if a light had gone out behind them. Its breath fogged up a circle of condensation. And it didn't cry this time. It didn't move, either. Daniel dropped the mug with a shatter and rushed to the door, flinging it open with such force that the cold slapped him like a punishment. He knelt by the cub, running his hands over its fur. It was cold, not dangerously so, but enough to worry him. Snowflakes clung to its ears. Its limbs were trembling again. "Where's your mama?" Daniel whispered, scanning the tree line. But there was no sign of the mother bear. No tracks. No distant rustle in the woods. Nothing. He carried the cub inside and wrapped it in the same wool blanket as before. He fed it more oatmeal and warmed its paws near the fire. And all the while, one thought looped endlessly in his mind. She had left the cub. Or worse, she was gone. The notion carved a hollow place in Daniel's chest. Had she returned just to say goodbye? Had she realized she couldn't go on? That her cub had a better chance surviving here, with him? He remembered the look in her eyes, the knowing, the strange stillness. The way she had tilted her massive head toward him. The cub had been her life, her legacy, her burden, and now it was his. Days passed. The snowstorm deepened. The roads into town became impassable, and even the satellite signal on Daniel's emergency radio blinked in and out. He didn't care. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his cabin and the quiet life he now shared with this orphaned animal. He named her Luna. It came to him one night as he sat by the fire, watching her sleep curled beside his boots. The crescent-shaped scar on her flank reminded him of the moon's sliver. And there was something hauntingly quiet about her, something that reminded him of nighttime snow, of things hidden in shadow yet stubbornly surviving. Luna began to gain strength. She followed Daniel from room to room, occasionally pawing at his pant leg or trying to climb onto the couch when she thought he wasn't looking. He tried not to humanize her too much, tried to maintain boundaries. But every time she cried in her sleep or pressed her small body against his boots during a thunderous gust outside, something melted inside him. He knew she couldn't stay. He began making calls to local wildlife rehab centers once the power returned. Most had long waitlists. Others said they weren't equipped to take in a bear cub during the winter. But one name kept resurfacing: Elaine Ridley, a retired biologist who ran a private sanctuary in the mountains about 70 miles east. She didn't advertise, didn't accept tours. But she had a reputation for being a miracle worker with abandoned wildlife, especially bears. Daniel left a message on her landline, not expecting a call back. But 3 days later, it came. Her voice was brisk but warm. "I hear you've got a little miracle," she said. He explained everything: the cub's appearance, the mother's injuries, the days they spent together. Elaine listened without interruption. Then, softly, "She chose you, you know." Daniel didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "The mother. Bears don't give up their young easily. If she brought that cub back to your door, she knew she wasn't going to make it. And she trusted you to give her cub a chance. You must have done something right." The words stuck with him long after they hung up. They agreed that Elaine would try to make the trip in a week, weather permitting. Until then, Daniel was to care for Luna, keep her safe, warm, and fed. Easy enough, if your heart wasn't breaking with every day she grew more attached. That night, Daniel stepped outside with Luna beside him. She stood at the edge of the porch, sniffing the air, ears twitching. Snowflakes drifted slowly, as if hesitant to land. Daniel looked up at the stars. "You're out there somewhere," he murmured. "A part of you still is. I see it in her." Luna chuffed, then rubbed against his leg. He didn't say anything else. He just stood in the cold, with the stars above and a cub at his side, and a promise forming silently in his heart. Whatever happened next, he would not let her down. The morning sun broke through the trees like golden needles piercing the snowy canopy. For the first time in days, the world outside the cabin shimmered with a light that didn't feel hostile, as though the storm had finally breathed its last and left behind a fragile stillness. It was the kind of silence Daniel hadn't felt in years. Not the oppressive silence of grief, but something new. Something like peace. Inside the cabin, Luna was curled in her usual place near the fireplace, her breathing slow and even, paws twitching slightly in her dreams. Her fur had grown fuller since her first night, and her eyes no longer held that shadowy glaze of hunger and fear. She still whimpered now and then in her sleep. Some habits didn't go away overnight, but Daniel had begun to notice a change. Her movements had become more playful. She pawed at the rug, chased specks of ash that drifted from the hearth, even tried once to climb into the sink while Daniel was washing dishes. Her spirit, once dampened by cold and loss, was beginning to stretch. Still, every day she grew stronger. The knot in Daniel's chest tightened. Because every step forward brought them closer to goodbye. Elaine Ridley was coming today. The drive was a long one, over 2 hours from her private sanctuary, weather permitting. Daniel had called her again the night before to confirm that the roads were finally clear enough. She had laughed softly when he said, "I hope Luna behaves." "She'll be fine," Elaine had replied. "It's you I'm worried about." And now, standing at the window, Daniel watched the long path from the tree line down to his cabin, looking for the first signs of tire tracks. His fingers drummed against the windowsill, and his heart beat a little too loudly in his ears. When the vehicle finally appeared, a forest green pickup with a rust-streaked grille and a wooden crate strapped in the back, it didn't pull up dramatically or kick snow into the air. It crept forward with purpose, as though the person behind the wheel had done this 1,000 times before. Elaine Ridley stepped out wearing a thick navy parka, snow boots covered in salt rings, and a look in her eyes that Daniel recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who had seen too much of nature's pain to ever be surprised by it again. "Daniel," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm. "You look exactly how I pictured. Tired, kind, and completely out of your depth." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "That obvious, huh?" "Only because I've been there." Inside, Luna stirred at the new voice. She sniffed the air, then padded cautiously into the front room. The moment her eyes met Elaine's, she froze. Elaine didn't approach. She crouched low, letting her backpack slide from her shoulder slowly. She removed her gloves and placed her bare hands flat on the ground. "Hey there, little moon," she whispered. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." Daniel blinked. Did you just call her? Little Moon? Yeah. Elaine glanced up at him. Crescent scar on her side, right? He nodded slowly. Elaine smiled. They always tell you their name. We just have to listen. Luna inched forward. One step, then another. She sniffed Elaine's outstretched fingers, then lowered her head, not in fear, but in a strange kind of trust, as if she sensed that this woman knew things, knew how to help. Daniel stood back and watched the scene unfold like a stranger in his own life. He had imagined this moment 100 ways, Luna panicking, resisting, running, but never this. Elaine rose to her feet with practiced grace. She's ready. I don't know if I am, Daniel admitted, voice barely audible. Elaine looked at him for a long time. That's the hardest part. You gave her what she needed to survive. But now she needs more than survival. She needs to learn how to be wild again, how to find food, defend herself, navigate the world as a bear. And that's not something we can teach, not unless we're one of them. Daniel's eyes stayed on Luna. But what if she forgets me? Elaine didn't answer right away. She knelt again beside the cub and ran her hand gently along the curve of her back. She won't. Not really. She might not remember your face in 10 years. But she'll remember that someone gave her warmth when the world was frozen. That someone fed her when she was starving. That someone loved her when she had nothing left. Those things, they get into the bones. And they stay. Daniel swallowed hard. The crate was lined with straw and thick padding. Elaine placed a soft towel inside, one that still smelled of the cabin, of pine and firewood and Daniel. She lifted Luna gently, supporting her weight with practiced hands, and settled her into the crate. The cub didn't fight it. She looked up at Daniel one last time, eyes wide and unblinking. He leaned in, pressed a hand to the bars. Goodbye, Luna. She let out a low, soft huff, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something in between, something that sounded like understanding. Then Elaine secured the crate, closed the tailgate, and turned to Daniel. We'll send updates. Photos. Maybe even videos if she lets us get close. Promise. Elaine smiled. Cross my heart. As the truck rumbled away, Daniel stood in the doorway of the cabin, arms crossed, eyes on the path she had disappeared down. The snow had started to fall again, light and slow, like feathers. Inside, the cabin felt too quiet. But in that silence, something else stirred, not grief, exactly. Not loss. A kind of fullness. Like he had played his part in something ancient and sacred. He turned from the door and went back inside. The hearth still glowed. The blankets still smelled of pine. And though the room felt smaller without her, the memory of what had happened here filled every space like light. She had come to his door in the night, crying. And now she was gone, but not forgotten. The weeks after Luna's departure passed like pages turned slowly in a book Daniel wasn't ready to finish. At first, he found himself listening for the soft padding of her paws on the wooden floor, the rhythmic breaths as she slept by the fireplace, or the scratch of her claws against the back door when she wanted to go out. But the cabin was quiet now, eerily so, and in that stillness, Daniel realized just how much she had changed the rhythm of his days. Her presence had reawakened something dormant in him, not just the instinct to care, but the willingness to feel. For so long, his grief had insulated him from the world, wrapped him in layers of numbness he had mistaken for peace. Losing Luna wasn't like losing a pet or a wild animal he'd briefly helped. It was like letting go of a chapter in his own healing. She had come broken, frightened, and alone, and in trying to save her, he'd begun to save himself. He still walked the forest trails each morning. He brought sunflower seeds and left them in small piles for the birds, and kept the salt lick filled at the edge of the clearing. He chopped wood more slowly now, not out of fatigue, but mindfulness. And at night, when the snow fell in silver sheets across the hills, he sat by the fire with his journal and tried to find the words to explain what Luna had taught him. He didn't write poetry. He wasn't a man of flowery language. But in his own quiet way, Daniel began to record the journey not just of her, but of himself. One night, in mid-February, as the last storm of the season whispered through the trees, a padded envelope arrived at the cabin. It bore no return address, just a handwritten label in black marker, for Daniel. Inside were 3 photographs, a folded letter, and a small pendant on a leather cord. The first photo showed Luna standing in a wide, grassy enclosure, her fur glistening in the sunlight. She looked healthy, larger, and far more confident than the trembling cub he remembered. The second photo showed her perched on a log, paws pressed playfully against the chest of another bear cub, darker, stockier, with a mischievous tilt to its eyes. And the third photo? That one stopped him cold. It was Luna, curled in a ball inside a den, her head resting protectively on a smaller bear cub. Not hers, Elaine had explained in the letter, but an orphan from another rescue, one who had refused to interact with the other cubs until Luna approached it. She didn't just survive, Elaine had written. She became a leader. Daniel held the letter tightly in his hands for a long time. When he finally looked at the pendant, he saw that it was carved from bone, delicate, smooth, shaped like a crescent moon. On the back, someone had scratched the word home. That night, Daniel wore the pendant to bed. He didn't dream. Or maybe he did, but the dreams were soft, indistinct, and warm like snow melting beneath a spring sun. The days grew longer. The ice on the lake began to crack. Sap rose in the trees, and the wind carried the smell of thawing earth. One morning in March, Daniel woke to the sound of birds, not the lonely cry of winter scavengers, but the trilling of finches, warblers, and thrushes returning to the woods. He opened his cabin door and stepped outside, breathing in the air like it was the first time in years. The snow had retreated in patches, revealing mossy stones, brown earth, and shoots of early green. And that's when he saw it. A single paw print, pressed deeply into the softening snow. It was unmistakably bare and fresh. Daniel crouched beside it, brushing a gloved hand along the edge. His first thought was caution, bears this early? But there was no urgency, no fear, just a sense of being watched. He rose slowly and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. But in the silence, something stirred. Not sound, not movement. Just presence. As if the forest itself acknowledged him. He smiled and whispered, "Thank you." That afternoon, he began carving again. Not out of boredom or habit, but purpose. He found a wide, flat piece of driftwood by the lake, cleaned it, sanded it down, and began etching it with a small carving knife. The lines were simple: a bear's silhouette, a cabin, a snowy trail. At the bottom, he wrote in block letters, "When the wild comes to your door, listen." He nailed the sign to the side of the cabin, not as a warning, but as a memory, a marker for the wild miracle that had once sought shelter beneath his roof. Years passed. Seasons changed. The cabin weathered. Daniel aged. New animals found their way into the clearing: foxes, owls, even a young moose once that wandered too close to the firewood stack. But every winter, on the first snowfall of the year, Daniel set out a bowl of warm milk and a folded wool blanket on the porch. Not because he expected a bear cub to return, but because he believed in what that cub had represented. A second chance. A reason to care again. A reminder that sometimes, the ones who cry in the night are the ones who save you. And one final spring, long after Daniel's hair had turned white and his hands had grown too stiff for carving, a new couple arrived in the valley. They had bought the property after hearing it had once belonged to the man with the bear. They found the sign still hanging, a little crooked, a little faded, but still legible. Inside, they found stacks of journals, photos, and the pendant still resting on the mantel. And as they walked the trails and sat by the fire, they often felt as if they weren't quite alone. That something kind, something gentle, still lingered in the walls. The story spread slowly, from the valley to the nearby towns. Some thought it a legend. Others said they'd seen a female bear in the woods with a moon-shaped scar and a gentle way of watching from a distance. Whether it was her or not, no one could say for sure. But the story lived on. Because once, in the heart of a freezing winter, a starving cub had cried at a stranger's window, and in doing so, had taught him how to feel again. And that, more than anything, was the miracle.